Hi everybody, welcome back. Glad you could tune in again. So we're working our way through these membership pledges and we've been looking at them individually. We've got down to number 6. I want to read it to you and then make a few comments on it. Here's what it says. We've pledged to support this congregation by our prayers, attendance, tithing and labour, and by the spreading of the gospel to those outside the faith. I want to just think in this devotion about prayer and our commitment to support one another within the congregation in prayer. That's one of the things we've committed to do. Now, what would it mean to do that? Well, clearly, there's a certain point at which it's helpful to think about prayer in general. And there is a mountain of devotional and theological literature on this subject. There's a ton of stuff from the Puritan period, from earlier in the church's history, from the Reformation period, and more recently as well. There's a whole pile of good and some not so good writings on the subject of prayer. If you wanted a couple of recommendations, more recently, there's a great book by Paul Miller called A Praying Life. Many people have found Don Carson's book, A Call to Spiritual Reformation, to be very helpful. I've enjoyed that one as well. Calvin's Institutes on the subject of prayer in book 3, I think it's chapter 20, is a really insightful and helpful section on the subject of prayer. And there's a bunch of other stuff from earlier in the church's history. If you want more, just give me a shout. But hopefully that will give you some thoughts if you wanted to do some reflection and reading and study on the subject. Getting more practical, thinking about our own lives and particularly the task of praying for one another, I want to just share with you 2 or 3 thoughts that I found practically to be quite helpful. I think it's beneficial for us to be praying specifically for people. It's tempting and perhaps a little too easy just to pray something like, oh Lord, please bless everybody at All Saints. And I don't want to criticize a prayer like that. It's wonderful to pray that the Lord would bless one another in that way. But I think we may find it easier to persevere in prayer and better in lots of ways, not least as we're getting to know one another, that we can be praying for specific things about specific people and families. Please don't feel guilt-tripped that you've got to pray for everybody in the whole church every day. I don't think that's the case at all. There may be situations when somebody has particular needs where for a season we're praying for them specifically every day, perhaps if they're about to give birth or they're not well or something else has happened. But I think it may be helpful for us, along with our general prayers for the health and faithfulness and stability of the congregation as a whole, to be praying for specific people, so to speak, going round on a rota through the families and individuals at All Saints. You can get hold of a church directory if you're a member at All Saints. You might like to pray through that list. My family and I have constructed a kind of monthly ring binder which has a page for each day of the month, and there are names and other topics and people written on each page, so we cycle through that in our family worship in the ordinary course of events. Just personally, I've got a kind of electronic version of the same thing, which is part of the to-do list software that I use to try and bring some organisation to my personal life and my work life. And I've got people, all you guys for a start, on a recurring cycle so that every 2 weeks or whatever the time period is, I'm praying for everybody by name. And I find that helpful because it makes sure that I'm covering all the people I want to pray for, and I can include folks here and the church back in London and other concerns, missionaries I know, and my children and my wife and all those sorts of things. So having a list, being organised, helps us to pray for one another in that kind of way. And what it also allows us to do, finally, is to be a little more well-defined in our prayers. As we're getting to know one another, it's tremendously helpful for us to be praying about specific things for specific people. And so perhaps you've got a wonderful memory and you can just remember everybody's particular needs, in which case, fantastic, that's wonderful. Do so as you're praying for them. But you may find it helpful just to make a little note of things. If you've got some electronic version of a prayer diary that you're following through, you might like to just stick a note next to the names of particular people, just to identify things that come up in the course of conversation or things that people ask you to pray about. It's much better, I think, to do that and to be a little bit organised about it than to fall into the temptation that probably we've all got close to, even if we've not actually succumbed to occasionally, which is to say, oh, I'll pray for you, and then to think 5 minutes later, now what was it I was supposed to be praying for? much better just to write it down, get a little bit organised. If there's one area of our lives where we really do want to be organised, surely it's in this most important of all matters, in our prayers for one another, which after all, we've committed to do. So I hope that's helpful. I know many of you are doing something like this already. Many of you probably have far better systems than what I and my family have adopted, but if you've got nothing, best start with something. I hope that's helpful. The Lord bless you, and I'll see you soon.